Ruth drove the pitchfork into the post 2 inches from Eli Calloway's hand the instant his lantern found them in the dark corner of his barn. He didn't pull back. He didn't reach for the pistol at his hip. He just stood there in the dead flat heat of a Wyoming August night and looked at this child 10 years old, shaking with something that wasn't fear, and felt the first crack appear in something he'd spent 5 years building solid. Then the smaller one made a sound, and that crack split wide open. If you have ever loved a child lost one, or prayed someone would show up when no one did, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and follow along to the very end and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Eli Calloway had not opened his barn after dark in 5 years. Not since the night he'd gone looking for his wife and found her horse returned without her, and understood before he even reached the north pasture what the finding was going to cost him. After that, after the burial and the silence and the specific kind of emptiness that settled into a house when the person who made it a home was gone, he'd built habits. Habits were what kept a man upright when nothing else was doing the job. One of those habits was barn at sundown, cabin at dark, no reason to go back out. He went back out because he heard something. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. He wasn't drinking the way he spent most evenings when it came through the open window on the west side of the cabin. Not the horses. He knew his horses. 4 of them, and he knew every sound each one made the way a man knew his own breathing. This was underneath the horse sounds. Smaller, tighter. The kind of sound that had been trying very hard not to be a sound and had failed just once. Eli set down the cup. He picked up the lantern. He did not pick up the rifle, and later he would think about the fact that something in him had already decided before he crossed the yard that whatever was in his barn was not a threat that required a rifle. He was wrong about that in one sense, and right about it in every other. Ruth drove the pitchfork into the post 2 inches from his left hand the moment his lantern light found them. She was fast, faster than he expected. The tines bit into the dry wood with a sound like a small crack of thunder, and she had already stepped back and set herself with both hands gripping the handle. Jaw-locked eyes on him with an intensity that stopped him as completely as a locked door. She was 10 years old. Maybe. She might have been older and just small for it, or younger and just old in the eyes. Those eyes were dark green, sharp, and carrying something heavy that had been carried so long it had changed the shape of the person beneath it. Her dress had started out blue and was now the color of everything the road had done to it, dust and sweat and hard miles. Her hair was matted at her temples. Her feet were wrapped in cloth strips tied with cord because whatever shoes she'd started with were gone. "Don't," she said. One word, flat, not a warning, a statement about what was going to happen if he moved wrong. Eli did not move. "Both hands," she said. He raised them. Lantern in his right, nothing in his left. He kept his voice the way he kept everything these days, low, with the feeling pressed down underneath it where it wouldn't cause trouble. "All right. Both hands. I'm not reaching for anything." Her eyes moved to his hip. The pistol there, then back to his face. "Take it out slow," she said, "and set it on the ground." He looked at her face, at the muscle jumping in her jaw, at the way her knuckles had gone white on the pitchfork handle. He took the pistol out with 2 fingers and set it on the ground. Her shoulders dropped 1/4 of an inch. He filed that away. "We're not doing anything," she said. "We're just in here. We'll be gone by morning. You don't have to do anything." "All right," Eli said. "You don't have to get anybody." "All right. I mean it." Her voice stayed level, but something underneath the level had been rubbed raw. "We don't need anything from you. We just need to not be found tonight." Eli looked past her then, and he saw the smaller one. She was tucked into the far corner, where 2 walls met with loose hay pulled around her, like she'd tried to make a nest of it. She was curled on her side, and her face carried that particular flush that had nothing to do with the August heat, the flush of a body fighting something from the inside. Her hair was the same dark color as the older girl's, but lighter at the ends where summer had bleached it. She was 7 maybe. Small. Her chest was moving in a way that worked harder than a sleeping child should. "That your sister?" Eli said. Ruth moved immediately, putting herself more squarely between him and the smaller girl. "She's fine. She doesn't look fine. She's sleeping. She's got a fever. She's fine." The word came out harder the second time, the kind of hard that meant the opposite. "She just needs rest. She'll be better in the morning." Eli crouched down. Same level as her. Made himself smaller, the way you did with young horses that had been badly handled. His father had taught him that, and it was the most useful thing his father had ever given him. "How long has she had it?" Ruth's jaw tightened. She didn't answer. "I'm asking because it matters," he said. "Not because I'm trying to scare you. How long?" The pitchfork didn't waver, but something in her eyes did. One small shift, one crack in the wall, and then she had it back. "Since this morning," she said. "She was fine yesterday. She got hot, and then she started going slow. We stopped more than we should have." "How far did you walk today?" She looked at him with that measuring look, checking him for the price hidden in the concern the catch wrapped in the kindness. 12 miles, she said finally. "Maybe more. 12 miles. In August, heat in Wyoming. 7 years old with a fever building since sunrise." Eli stood up slowly. He did not move toward the smaller girl. He kept his hands where she could see them. "I've got cold water from the well, and I've got herb medicine that brings fever down. I can bring it out here if you want to stay in the barn, or I can take you inside. Either way, it's your choice." Ruth stared at him. "I'm not with the county," he said. He didn't know why he said it. He hadn't planned it. But something in the way she'd said, "We don't need to be found tonight," had told him enough, and the words came out before the thought finished itself. Something moved in her face. Fast and controlled, but real. She had not expected that. She'd had her response ready for something else entirely, and now she had to recalibrate, and he could see the recalibration happening behind those green eyes like weather turning. "Then who are you with?" she said. "Nobody. I run this ranch. My name is Eli Calloway. I've been on this land 11 years, and I'm not in the habit of turning children over to anybody." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then her eyes went to her sister, to the flush on that small face, the too fast breathing, the way the girl's hands were pressed together under her chin, like she was praying even in her sleep. "What's her name?" Eli asked. A pause. A long one. "Clara," Ruth said. "She gave it the way you gave something you couldn't afford to lose." "Clara." He repeated it carefully. "And yours." Another pause, shorter. "Ruth." "Ruth." He nodded once. "I'm going to the cabin to get water and the medicine. I'll set everything on the ground over there and you decide what to do with it. You keep the pitchfork." She looked at him. "Why would you do that?" The question had no pretense in it. Just a child who had learned that kindness was usually the shape a trap took before it closed. "Because Clara's 7 years old," Eli said. "And nobody should be 7 years old and sick in a barn in August." Ruth's throat moved. She didn't lower the pitchfork, but she didn't swing it either. Eli turned and walked to the cabin. Inside, he moved fast and without waste. Water from the well bucket still cool from the morning draw. The tin of dried herbs fever. Few willow bark and something else his wife had kept with a name he couldn't remember now. Only that she'd said it worked. He stood at the shelf with his hand on that tin and let the particular ache of that memory pass through him the way he'd learned to let it pass. Then he picked up the tin and the bucket and went back out. Ruth was standing when he returned. She'd gotten Clara up and had her pressed against her side with one arm around Clara's head, lolling against her shoulder, and she was braced with her legs wide and her jaw set, holding 60 pounds of sick child, with the determination of someone who had never once been allowed to put that weight down and had long since stopped noticing that her arms hurt. Eli stopped. He set everything on the ground between them, within her reach, outside his imposition. "You don't have to let me carry her," he said, "but she needs to lie flat somewhere cool. She's been upright all day, and her body's working against itself." Ruth looked at Clara's face. Her own face went through something complicated and private. He let it go through without comment. "There's a floor inside," she said. "There's a bed." "She gets the bed," said immediately, a rule she already had ready. "She gets the bed," Eli agreed. Ruth's eyes moved from the bucket to his face to Clara's flushed cheek and back to his face. She was running the math on every version of this going wrong, calculating with the focused intensity of someone who had been the only mathematician in every room she'd ever been in. He recognized that calculation. He'd done it himself in different circumstances in the first year after his wife died, when every decision felt like a door that might have a cliff behind it. Clara made a sound then, small and thin. Not a word. Just a sound, the sound of a child too young to have learned yet how to be quiet when she hurt. And that sound did what nothing else could. Ruth's face broke open. 1 second. 1 second where she was 10 years old and exhausted and terrified in ways she had no language for, carrying something no person her age should know the weight of. Then she had it back together, sealed and composed and set. "Okay," she said, barely a sound. "But I'm carrying her." "All right. And I'm not leaving her. I wouldn't ask you to. And if you try anything—" "I know," Eli said. "You've still got the pitchfork." Something shifted in her eyes. Not trust, not relief, but the thing that lived right at the edge of both of them, the place a person reached before they decided which way to go. She shifted Clara's weight and started toward him. He stepped aside. He picked up the bucket and the tin and walked behind her, not crowding, giving her the lead. The same way you walked a young horse that hadn't decided yet whether the gate at the end of the path was a threat or just a gate. The cabin's heat wrapped around them when he pushed the door open. August had pressed itself into every corner of the room, the dry closed heat of a structure that had been baking since sunrise. He'd thought to open the north window, and there was a faint pull of air through it, the best that summer offered. Ruth stepped inside and stopped. He watched her eyes sweep the room in one fast arc corner's window, the back door, the loft above, and file all of it. Every exit, every threat, catalogued in under 3 seconds. A child should not know how to do that. The fact that she did told him everything that needed telling about what had built her. "Bed's there," he said. She carried Clara across the room and lowered her onto the mattress with a slowness and care that told him she'd done this before, many times in places where she had to do it quietly and without waking anyone. She pulled the coverlet up to Clara's chin and pressed the back of her hand to her sister's forehead, and he heard her breath go sharp. "She's hotter," Ruth said. "The room does that at first. It'll come down once she's had the medicine and some time." Ruth stood by the bed with her back to him, both hands gripping the coverlet's edge, and she didn't speak. Eli worked the herbs into the water over the small camp stove, the way he'd been shown without rushing it. When the mixture was ready, he brought it to the bedside and crouched down. Clara's eyes were half open, glassy, unfocused, but they found his face when he moved close. "Hey, Clara," he said, low and easy. "I need you to drink some of this. Fair warning, it tastes like the bottom of a mud puddle." Clara's eyes went to Ruth. "It's okay." Ruth's voice to Clara was completely different from every other sound she'd made since he found them. Everything hard was gone. What was left was soft and steady and worn smooth with practice, the voice of someone who had been saying, "It's okay" to this particular person for so long that it had become a reflex deeper than thought. "It'll help. Drink it." Clara opened her mouth slightly. Eli tipped the cup in small amounts, giving her time between sips. Clara made a face at the bitterness. "I know," Eli said. "Tastes terrible. But you want to know the reason herb medicine always tastes bad." Clara blinked at him, those dark eyes slow and glassy. "Because if it tasted good, folks would drink it for fun. And then it'd stop being medicine and turn into a treat. Can't have that." Clara looked at him for a long moment, then barely a sound at all. "That don't make sense." "No," Eli agreed. "It don't." Something happened in Ruth's posture behind him. Some small degree of the iron went out of her spine. Just a fraction, just long enough to be real. When Clara had taken enough, her eyes drifted closed again. Eli straightened and moved back. Ruth settled onto the edge of the mattress with one hand resting lightly on her sister's arm, watching Clara's face with the focused attention of someone whose entire world had been reduced to this one task, this one person, this one breath, and then the next one after that. Eli poured a second cup of plain cool water and set it on the floor near Ruth without saying anything about it. She looked at it, then at him. "For you," he said. She didn't touch it right away. He didn't push. He settled into the chair near the stove, not between her and the door, not close, and picked up a piece of tack he'd been meaning to mend for 2 weeks. He worked the leather in silence. He didn't watch her. He gave her the space to make her own decision about the water, and the warmth, and the man who hadn't yet done what she was waiting for him to do. After a while, she picked up the cup and drank. The lamp burned low. Outside, the summer night pressed down thick and still, the heat not lifting the way it would come. September, the cicadas going in the dark somewhere beyond the north fence. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Ruth said, without looking up from Clara, "They'll come looking." Eli kept working the leather. "Who will?" "Superintendent Vance. He's got 2 men that travel with him, and papers from the county." She paused. "He says those papers mean we go where he says and do what he says until we're 18. He says it like it's the law of God and the law of the land both at once, and there's no space between them for anything else." Eli's hands went still for 1 second. Then he kept working. "He say that to you directly. He said it to anyone who'd listen." Her voice carried the flatness of someone who'd heard a thing enough times that it had lost its power to shock and become just a fact of the landscape. "He said it like it was a kindness, said the county home was a gift from the state and we ought to be grateful." She said the word grateful the way you said the name of something that had bitten you. Clara took an extra biscuit from the kitchen 2 weeks ago because she was hungry. Vance had her made to stand outside in the noon sun for 2 hours. He told her it was so she'd learn what real hunger felt like. Eli set the tack down on his knee. He looked at the lamp flame. He looked at it for a moment and said nothing because some things required a moment before you could speak around them. "How long ago did you run?" he said. 3 days. She looked at him steadily. "We walked at night mostly. I know enough stars to stay off the main road. Clara did fine until yesterday." Her voice shifted on yesterday, something catching in it quickly controlled. "I should have stopped sooner. I thought if we got far enough south—" She stopped. Started again. "I didn't know your ranch was here until I smelled the horses." "You knew to look for horses. Horses mean a barn. A barn means water and shade and nobody asking questions at 2 in the morning." She said it simply the way she said most hard things, like it was just the weather, and you had to dress for it. "I've been learning what things mean for a while now." He looked at her. This 10-year-old girl with trail dust in her hair and cloth-wrapped feet, and a way of talking about suffering that had all the emotion pressed out of it by sheer repetition. Practical and worn and sharper than anything had a right to be at her age. "You're smart," he said. "I'm tired," she said, and in those 2 words was everything she wasn't saying. Every night she'd stayed awake so Clara could sleep. Every decision she'd made alone with nobody to check the math on. Every step of the last 3 days that she'd carried all of it, because there was no one else to carry any part of it. Eli stood and took the spare blanket from the peg by the door. He carried it across the room and set it on the floor beside the bed within her reach. He didn't drape it over her. He didn't touch her. He set it where she could get it if she decided she wanted it. She looked at it, then at him. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch. Vance won't come down this road in the dark. A man who carries papers as his weapon doesn't travel at night on an unfamiliar road. You've got until morning." "How do you know how he travels?" "I know the type," Eli said. He held her gaze steady and without pressure. "Sleep, Ruth. I'll be right here." She didn't sleep for a long time. He knew because he didn't sleep either. He sat with the tack across his knees and tracked every shift she made every time her breathing changed, every small sound from Clara that brought Ruth's hand immediately to her sister's face to check. He let the silence work, the way silence worked, slow and gradual, a room settling around people who were still deciding whether it was safe to settle in it. Somewhere past midnight, Clara's breathing eased, became slower and more even. Ruth noticed. He could tell because her own breathing changed in response. One long exhale, the first unclenched breath he'd heard from her since he'd walked through that barn door. And then, not long after that, in the thick dead heat of a Wyoming summer night, Ruth, 10 years old, 3 days running, carrying more than should fit inside one person's arms, stopped fighting it. Her head dropped to the edge of the mattress beside Clara's shoulder, one hand still resting on her sister's arm. And she slept. Not the half-awake, watchful kind. The real kind. The unguarded kind. The sleep of someone who had put something heavy down, and for one night at least, could not find the strength to pick it back up. Eli sat in the chair with the tack in his lap, and the lamp burning low, and the summer night pressing at the walls, and he watched over both of them through the long, still hours. He had told himself for 5 years that he was done with this. With the particular exposure that came from caring about something when the world had already showed him very clearly and very finally what it did to the things you cared about. He had built that understanding carefully and called it wisdom and lived inside it like a house with good solid walls. Sitting there in the heat with 2 children breathing quietly in the corner, he was starting to reconsider what he'd built and what he'd called it. Outside, the summer dark lay flat and wide in every direction. Somewhere on a road to the north, a man named Vance was sleeping in a county-paid room, and in the morning he would have his papers and his 2 men, and the absolute certainty of someone who had never once been told no by anyone who could make it stick. Eli looked at the 2 small shapes on his bed. He looked at the lamp. He looked at the door. Then he settled back in the chair and waited for morning, the way he waited for everything that mattered, quietly, without flinching, and without any intention of moving out of the way. Morning came the way August mornings came in Wyoming, not gradual, not gentle, but sudden, like a door thrown open on a furnace. The light hit the east window hard and flat, and the heat followed it in without apology. Eli had not slept. He'd fed the lamp twice through the night and sat with the tack in his lap and mended none of it and watched the 2 girls breathe. He watched Clara's chest rise and fall with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a fever that had broken somewhere around 3 in the morning. He'd marked the moment she stopped fighting the blanket, and her hands uncurled from their tight press against her chin and just lay open. That was how you knew. Not the sweating, not the color coming back. It was the hands going soft. Ruth woke the way he expected her to by now, fast, complete, her head coming off the mattress edge and her eyes finding him in the chair before she'd drawn her second breath. Sharp and immediate, like sleep was just a continuation of staying alert, and she'd simply switched modes rather than actually rested. He raised one hand. Still here. Same man. She pressed the back of her hand to Clara's forehead before she'd fully straightened. He watched her do it, and watched the tension in her shoulders change its shape, not disappear, just shift from crisis into something slightly less acute. Fever broke, he said. She didn't respond to that. She already knew. Her hand had told her. She sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at her sister's face for a long moment, the way you looked at something you'd been terrified of losing and needed to confirm was still there before you could do anything else. Clara's eyes opened slowly. She blinked at the ceiling with the open, uncomplicated confusion of a child waking somewhere new. Then she found Ruth's face, and her whole body settled. "Ruth," she said. Her voice was thin and rough at the edges, but real. "Right here," Ruth said immediately, the same reflex she'd had the night before, automatic as breathing. Clara blinked again, and her eyes drifted sideways to Eli in the chair. She looked at him with the frank, unhurried curiosity of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned to front-load her fear. She just looked at him, turning him over with those dark eyes, the way a child turned over a rock to see what was under it, deciding what to make of him without pretense or performance. "You're the man from last night," she said. "I am. You gave me the bad medicine." "I did." Clara considered this with great seriousness. "It made me feel better," she said, as if this surprised and slightly offended her. "Generally does," Eli said. "It still tasted bad." "Still does." Clara appeared to accept this as a fair and honest accounting. She pushed herself up on her elbows and looked around the cabin with the same methodical curiosity she'd applied to him, taking it in without Rush's watchfulness, just genuinely interested in the world she found herself in. "Is there food?" she said. Ruth's jaw moved. "Clara." "It's a fair question," Eli said. He stood and moved to the stove. "Cornmeal and salt pork or eggs if you'd rather." Clara looked at Ruth with an expression that was entirely question. Ruth looked at Eli with the measuring look he was becoming familiar with, checking the offer for walls, checking him for the fine print. He kept his back partially to her and let her check. "Eggs?" Clara said. "Clara, you ask, you don't just, eggs are fine," Eli said. "Eggs it is." He cooked without ceremony, and the smell of it moved through the cabin and did what smells did in the morning, made the night feel further away than it actually was. He set 2 plates on the table and stepped back. Ruth guided Clara to the chair with a hand between her shoulder blades, steady practiced, and sat beside her. Clara ate with the unguarded, uncomplicated hunger of a child whose body had just spent the night fighting something and had won and needed to recover the resources it had burned through doing it. Ruth ate with the controlled efficiency he'd noticed the night before, steady and focused, not fast, not wasteful, like someone who had learned not to trust that food stayed available. He poured water and set it between them, and didn't sit down himself. He stood near the stove with his coffee and gave them the table. After a while, Clara looked up at him with something in her expression that had shifted since the first minute, like she'd finished her initial assessment, and moved on to something more specific. "Do you have children?" she asked. The question landed in the silence of the cabin and sat there. "No," Eli said. "Did you want them?" "Clara," Ruth said, a warning quiet but clear. "I'm just asking," Clara said, which was exactly what she was doing. Asking without agenda, without cruelty. Just asking the way children asked things when they genuinely wanted to know the answer. Eli looked at the cup in his hand for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I did." Clara nodded at this, with the solemn gravity of a child receiving important information and filing it correctly. "My mama wanted us," she said. "She told Ruth every night. Ruth remembers it better than me because I was too little." "Clara." Ruth's voice had gone quieter. Not a warning anymore. Something more careful. "I'm just telling him." Clara looked back at Eli. Ruth remembers almost everything. It's her, she does it on purpose. She memorizes things so they don't get lost. She paused, considering. "I think she's afraid if she forgets something important, it's like it never happened." The cabin was quiet for a moment. Eli looked at Ruth, who was looking at her plate, with her jaw set in the way she said it, when something had gotten past her guard, and she was deciding whether to be angry about it. He didn't comment on what Clara had said. He recognized that dignity, too. He left it alone. "I'm going into town this morning," he said. "There's a woman there, Dorothy Crane. She runs the dry goods, and she knows this county better than anyone I've ever met. She'll know what Vance's papers actually say and what they don't say, and that's information we need before he shows up on this road." Ruth looked up from her plate. "You're leaving." "For 2 hours, 3 at most." "And we stay here. Or you come with me. That's your choice." She held his gaze. The measuring look was back in full force. "If you're going to hand us over to someone," she said, "it doesn't matter whether you do it here or there. But if you're going to do it, I'd rather know now so I can think." "I'm not going to hand you over to anyone." "People say. I know what people say." He kept his voice even. "Ruth, I'm telling you what I mean to do. If I wanted to hand you over, I'd have done it last night. Vance would have thanked me for it and gone home before dawn." He set the cup down. "Instead, I sat in that chair all night. Now I'm going to Dorothy Crane's store. You can stay here, or you can come. Those are the choices." Something worked through her face. She looked at Clara. Clara was watching the two of them with that open, unhurried attention she brought to most things, and she didn't offer an opinion. She just waited to see what Ruth decided the way she'd been waiting to see what Ruth decided her whole life. "We'll stay," Ruth said. "Barn's unlocked. Horses are in the south stalls. If you feel like company, the gray one's name is Bess, and she won't bite. The roan will give you a look like you've personally insulted his whole family, but he's all performance and no follow-through." Clara glanced at the door with an expression of immediate and specific interest. Eli put his hat on and went out. The ride into town took 40 minutes on a road that had been baked hard as brick by 6 weeks of July and August without rain. The dust rose behind him in a slow boil and settled on his shoulders and the back of his neck, and he let it settle. He was thinking about Vance. About the kind of man who used papers the way other men used fists, with the absolute confidence of someone who had never had either one taken away from him. He was also thinking about what Ruth had said. 3 days, 12 miles yesterday, cloth around her feet where the shoes had been. She'd made those decisions one at a time, alone with a 6-7-year-old beside her, and a man with county authority somewhere on the road behind her, and she'd kept making them until she ended up in his barn. That wasn't luck. That was a kind of intelligence that most grown men never developed because they'd never had sufficient reason to. The town of Harlan was the kind of town that had started as a trading post and expanded without a plan. Buildings set down, wherever the first man to build them had decided to set them roads that went where people had walked often enough to make them roads. It was not a large town, but it had what it needed: a livery, a post, a saloon. 2 churches that disagreed about nearly everything, and Dorothy Crane's general store, which had been the center of practical information about the county for as long as anyone could remember. He tied up outside and pushed through the door. Dorothy Crane was behind the counter doing the inventory she did every Tuesday with the focused precision of a woman who had run a business alone for 12 years and had learned that no one else would do it correctly, so she might as well not ask. She was 60-something, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had lived enough weather that weather could no longer do much to it. She looked up when he came in. "Eli Calloway," she said. "First time I've seen you before noon on a weekday in I don't know how long." "Need to talk to you," he said. She set down her pen. "I can see that." She looked at his face the way women like her looked at things completely without flinching, taking stock. "Sit down and tell me." He told her everything. He was not a man who used many words, and he didn't use many now. He told it plainly in the order it had happened, and Dorothy listened, the way she listened to everything, without interrupting, without moving, without letting her face tell him what she thought, until he'd finished the last word. When he was done, the store was quiet around them. "Harold Vance," Dorothy said. She said the name the way you said the name of something that had been a problem for a while, and that you had been waiting to come to a head. "You know him." "I know of him. I know his name comes up when anyone in this county tries to trace where the children from the home end up, and what they're doing when they get there." She stood and moved to the back of the counter, opening a drawer, with the practiced ease of a woman who had kept records about everything, because records were the most reliable kind of memory. "There are 4 families in this county right now with children from that home working their properties. I've been watching it for 2 years. I never had anything solid enough to bring to anyone." She turned and looked at him. "You said the older girl remembers things deliberately." "That's what her sister said. Names, dates, specific incidents." "That's what it sounds like." Dorothy set a folded paper on the counter. "Judge Harriet Caldwell rides into Harlan the last Thursday of every month. She's the most honest person I know in a position of authority in this territory, which means she's sometimes inconvenient and always reliable. Last Thursday of the month is 9 days from now." She looked at him. "If you file a custodial claim before Vance files a recovery petition, you're already in the record as a party with interest. That changes how the hearing runs. I've got 9 days. You've got 9 days and a man with papers who probably already knows which road you're on." She folded her hands on the counter. "Eli, do you want those girls?" He'd known the question was coming. He'd been turning it over since somewhere around 2 in the morning. "I want them safe." he said. She looked at him with the same flat patience she used on people who gave her the wrong answer to the right question. That's not what I asked. He looked at the counter, at the paper she'd set down, at the dust still settled on the back of his hands from the road. Yes, he said. Yeah, I do. Dorothy nodded once the way she nodded when something was settled, and she was ready to move to the next thing. Then here's what you're going to... The door opened. He turned around. She came in out of the heat the way the heat came in suddenly without announcement, bringing the bright flat light of the August morning with her. She was maybe 30, maybe a little past it, with dark hair pinned up in the careless, practical way of someone who'd done it in a hurry and hadn't thought about it since. She wore a riding coat despite the heat and carried herself with the squared-off, deliberate posture of a woman who had recently decided to take up a specific amount of space in the world and intended to hold it. She was carrying a paper in her left hand that she'd folded and unfolded enough times that the creases were soft. She stopped when she saw Eli, not startled, just reassessing the way a person reassessed a room that had more in it than they'd expected. May, Dorothy said. Come in. This is Eli Calloway. He runs the Calloway Ranch about 7 miles south. She looked at Eli. This is May Whitfield. She's been in town about 3 weeks. She's got a property dispute with the Whitfield family, her late husband's people, and I've been helping her understand the county filing process. She paused with the brief weighted pause of a woman who chose her words precisely. She's got her own reasons to understand how this county handles papers and what they actually mean. May Whitfield looked at him. She had gray eyes, the kind that went lighter or darker depending on the light, and they were doing that now in the bright doorway. And there was a directness in them that wasn't aggression, but was something adjacent to it. The directness of a woman who had learned that softening her look got her looked past and had made the practical decision to stop doing it. Calloway, she said. Not unfriendly, just level. Dorothy said your name once before. Something about the north fence line bordering the Miller property. It does, he said. The Whitfield land borders Miller's on the east side. She set the folded paper on the counter beside Dorothy. If your fence line and the Whitfield eastern border are where I think they are, you might be the only neighbor I've got who isn't already in the family's pocket. I'm not in anybody's pocket, he said. No, she said, reading his face the way she read everything it seemed quickly and without performance. I didn't figure you were. She turned back to Dorothy. I got another letter this morning from his brother. He says if I don't sign the deed transfer by end of month, he's going to the circuit court and filing an adverse claim. He can file, Dorothy said. It doesn't mean he'll win. He's got 3 lawyers, and I've got a letter from my dead husband and a deed with my name on it. She said it without self-pity, just the math of her situation stated plainly. So I need to understand what winning looks like, and how long it takes, and whether I can afford to wait for it. Dorothy looked at both of them standing on her side of the counter. Something moved in her face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not one. Seems to me, she said carefully, that you two have more in common than either of you came in here expecting. Eli looked at May Whitfield. May Whitfield looked at Eli Calloway. She spoke first. You in some kind of trouble with the county? Not yet, he said, working on it. Something shifted in her expression. One corner of her mouth moved just barely, not quite a smile, but the shadow one cast before it arrived. Well, she said. What kind? He looked at her for a moment. At the folded paper in front of her, and the riding coat worn in August heat, and the gray eyes that had seen something recently that had permanently adjusted the way they looked at the world. He had no reason to tell her anything. He'd walked in here to talk to Dorothy and had not planned on anyone else. 2 girls, he said. 10 and 7, county orphanage, man named Vance has papers on them. May Whitfield was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she set both hands flat on the counter and looked at Dorothy. How does the emergency custodial filing work? She said. Walk me through it again. Both situations, his and mine. She glanced at Eli. Because it sounds like we've got 9 days to do 2 things at once, and 9 days is not very long. He hadn't said anything about 9 days. She'd been keeping track of the calendar herself and had arrived at the same number. He looked at her and understood something in that moment. Not everything, not nearly, but the particular thing you understood about a person when you saw them doing the same calculation you were doing and getting the same answer. Dorothy was already pulling out her files. Outside, the August sun pressed down on Harlan's dirt streets without mercy or moderation. The way it pressed down on everything in that country without caring what it burned, only that it kept burning. And somewhere south on the road that led back to his ranch, 2 girls were sitting in his cabin, or standing in his barn, or looking out his window toward town, waiting to see whether the last door they'd tried was going to hold. He rode back with May Whitfield. It hadn't been a decision so much as a conclusion. They'd both arrived at separately, and at the same time the way 2 people sometimes reached the same door from different directions. Dorothy had laid out the filing process for both of them across the counter with her files spread between them, and somewhere in the middle of it, May had said plainly, and without making it larger than it was, "If Vance comes before you're back, those girls need someone at that ranch who isn't a child." And that was all she said about it. She'd folded her own papers into her coat pocket and gone to get her horse. Dorothy watched them go from the door of the store. Eli didn't look back, but he felt her watching. Felt the particular quality of attention that Dorothy Crane brought to things she considered important enough to witness. They rode most of the 7 miles in silence. May Whitfield rode the way she did most things, straight practical without performance. Her horse was a dark bay that moved well, and she sat it like someone who'd been riding since before she had opinions about it. The August heat pressed down from above and rose up from the baked road below, and met in the middle, with no mercy for anything caught between. After a while she said, "How long have you had the ranch?" 11 years, he said. "Alone?" He looked at the road ahead. 5 years alone. She didn't press on that. She had the quality he was beginning to notice of understanding exactly where the edge of a thing was and not stepping past it. "The Whitfield land was my husband's," she said. "James? He died 14 months ago. Fever. It was fast." She said it the same way Ruth said hard things like, the emotion had been pressed out by repetition, until what remained was just the fact of it. His brother Thomas was in the will contingent. He got the livestock and the equipment. I got the land and the deed. He's been trying to get the land back ever since, and he's got the money and the lawyers to make trying look like winning. But the deed's yours. The deed is mine. Whether that matters depends on which judge hears it and on what day and in what mood. She glanced at him sideways. Which is why 9 days matters, and why Dorothy's letter to Judge Caldwell's clerk matters. First filing sets the frame for everything that comes after. "You know a lot about how county filings work," Eli said. "I know a lot about what happens to women who don't know," she said. It wasn't bitter, just true. He nodded. That was all. They came over the low rise south of the ranch, and he saw the cabin and the barn and the yard between them, and then he saw something else. Ruth was standing in the yard. Not near the barn, not near the cabin door. Standing in the center of the yard with her arms at her sides, face turned south toward the road, like she'd been there long enough to pick her spot, and had decided it was the right one to stand in. Clara was behind her on the porch, sitting on the step with her knees drawn up, watching the same road with the same focused attention, in a 7-year-old's version of the same posture. Ruth saw them coming and didn't move. Stood and watched and waited until they were close enough that she could see his face clearly, and whatever she found there let her drop her shoulders about half an inch. "You brought somebody," she said. "This is May Whitfield," Eli said, dismounting. "She knows the county filing system, and she's got her own reasons to understand how men with papers operate. She's going to help." Ruth looked at May the way she looked at everything new, completely without hurry, running the inventory. May looked back at her without softening her expression or making it larger, just meeting the look with a level steadiness that seemed to pass whatever test Ruth was running. "How old are you?" Ruth said. 31, May said. "You don't look it." "I've been told that," Usually by people who think it's a compliment. Something in Ruth's face shifted. Not quite a smile. The shadow one. Eli filed the custodial claim this morning, May said, pulling up before Ruth could decide what she thought about the almost smile. Dorothy Crane sent a letter to Judge Caldwell's court clerk this morning before we left. If the clerk moves the way Dorothy thinks she will, we'll have a hearing date before Vance gets a recovery petition through the system. Ruth absorbed this. She looked at Eli. What does custodial claim mean? It means I'm telling the court I want to be responsible for you and Clara, he said. And the court decides. The judge decides. Yes. Judge Caldwell, Ruth said. Is she honest? Dorothy says she's the most honest person she knows in a position of authority in this territory. Ruth was quiet for a moment, running something through. Dorothy Crane, she said. Is she the kind of person who says things like that and means them, or the kind who says things like that because it's what you say? Eli looked at her. She's the kind who weighs every word before she spends it, he said. So when she spends one, it means something. Ruth held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she said, okay. In the way she said okay, careful measured 1 inch at a time. She turned and looked at Clara on the porch. Come here, Clara. Clara came down the step and crossed the yard and stood beside her sister without being told why or what for, just came, because Ruth called her, and that was sufficient. She looked up at May with her frank, uncomplicated curiosity. Your horse is pretty, Clara said. Thank you, May said. His name is Drum. Does he have a personality? He's deeply opinionated about everything and has no interest in keeping it to himself. Clara appeared to find this deeply satisfying. Like Ruth, she said. Clara, Ruth said. It's true, Clara said simply. May looked at Ruth. I've heard worse things, she said. They went inside. That afternoon moved in a different kind of tension than the days before it. Not the blunt emergency of the first night. Not the careful negotiating of the days since, but something more stretched and interior. The particular quality of time that passed when you were waiting for something that was definitely coming, and the only variable was when. May sat at the table with Dorothy's papers spread out and walked Ruth through what the hearing would require, not making it soft. Not making it larger than it was, just laying out the mechanics of it, the way a practical person laid out the mechanics of anything that needed to be done. Ruth listened, the way she listened to everything important without moving, without interrupting, with those green eyes fixed on whoever was talking, like she was filing every syllable. Testimony means you say out loud in that room what you've been carrying in your head, May said. The names, the dates, the specific things. You told Eli about the biscuit and the noon sun. Clara, Ruth said. She took the biscuit. He made her stand in the yard at noon for 2 hours in July. When she came back in, she couldn't stop shaking for an hour. That's testimony, May said. The specific thing, what happened before it, what happened after, not how it made you feel what occurred. I know what occurred, Ruth said. I've been keeping track. How? In my head. Names and dates and what happened. The way Ruth Harper came back from the Morrison farm in June with burns on her hands that the supervisor wrote down as a kitchen accident. The way the 3 youngest boys disappeared from the home in February, and Vance said they'd been placed with family and nobody ever heard from them again. The way he keeps a record book in the office that doesn't match the record book he shows the county inspector. She paused. I read the real one upside down through the office window twice during yard chores. I memorized what I could. May Whitfield was very still. You memorized records, she said. I told you, Clara said from the corner of the room where she had stationed herself with a piece of rope she'd found and had been braiding with focused industry. She memorizes things. May looked at Eli. He looked back at her. She turned back to Ruth. Everything you just told me. Can you say all of it in that room in front of Vance? Ruth looked at the table. Something worked through her face. The same process he'd watched a dozen times, a hard thing moving through a person deciding what to do with it. Then she looked up. Yes, she said. I can say it in front of him. She paused. I've been in that room in my head 100 times. I've been saying it there. Saying it out loud to a judge doesn't scare me as much as going back. Nothing should scare you more than going back, May said. It wasn't cruelty. It was the kind of honest that treated a person as capable of handling the truth. Ruth held her gaze. No, she said. Nothing does. They heard the horses the next morning before anyone saw them. Eli heard them first. He was out at the well before sunrise, the only bearable time to move quickly in August, and he heard them on the South Road, a deliberate, unhurried pace, the pace of men who were not chasing anything because they were confident the thing they wanted wasn't going anywhere. He counted 3 horses by the sound and went inside. May was already awake at the table papers organized in the order she intended to use them if the morning required it. Ruth was sitting on the floor near the stove, with her arms wrapped around her knees, and he understood from the shadows under her eyes that she hadn't slept. He's coming, Eli said. Ruth's chin came up. Clara on the bed stirred and sat up and looked at the room with the immediate unclouded alertness of a child who had been sleeping lightly for 3 days. Both of you stay inside, Eli said. May, I'd like you at the table, visible when the door opens. I want him to see immediately that there are more people in this room than he planned for. May nodded. He looked at Ruth. She was on her feet now, both hands pressed flat against her thighs, jaw set. Ruth, he said, I mean it. Stay inside. I know, she said. I need you to trust me with the door. Something moved through her face. The same struggle he'd watched before, the part of her that had learned to trust no one, fighting with the smaller, newer part that had been sitting by his stove for 2 days and eating his food and watching him be careful with Clara. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Okay, she said. I trust you with the door. He went out. Vance pulled up 20 yards out and dismounted with the smooth, practiced precision of a man who had done this enough times that it had become choreography. He was broad through the shoulders and carried himself with the particular confidence of institutional authority, the unquestioned sureness of a man who had never once opened a door and found it locked against him. His 2 men stayed mounted, flanking him with the blank professional expressions of people paid to stand behind someone who did the talking. Mr. Calloway, Vance said, warm, educational, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. Harold Vance, County Welfare Administration. I believe you may have something that belongs to the county on your property. I've got horses, cattle, and a fence line that needs work, Eli said. Nothing that belongs to the county. Vance smiled with patient effort. I'm referring to 2 juvenile wards under county protective care, Ruth and Clara. They went missing from the home 4 days ago. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded paper. Recovery order issued by the county clerk. I'm authorized to collect them and return them to the facility. Eli looked at the paper without taking it. Authorized by the county clerk, he said, not a judge. The county clerk has authority over. The county clerk signs what he's told to sign, Eli said. That's an administrative order. It's not a court order. There's a difference, and I think you know it. He kept his voice easy, conversational, the way you talked when you wanted every word to land cleanly. I filed a custodial claim at the county office yesterday morning. Dorothy Crane sent a separate letter to Judge Caldwell's clerk requesting emergency scheduling. So before you tell me what that paper authorizes, you might want to consider that there's already a filing in the record that complicates your morning. Something moved across Vance's face. The smile stayed, but the warmth inside it shifted into something cooler and more precise. Mr. Calloway, I understand the impulse here. You found 2 children in a difficult circumstance, and you helped them. That's admirable. But those children are wards of the state, and my responsibility. Your responsibility, Eli said, is what I'd like to talk about. He tilted his head slightly. I know about Clara, the biscuit, July. 2 hours in the noon sun. He paused. I know about Ruth Harper's hands and what the supervisor's record said happened, and what actually happened. I know about the 3 boys who disappeared in February and the family placement that nobody can locate. He paused again. I know about 2 sets of books. The one you show the county inspector, and the one you keep in the office that you don't think anyone can read." Vance was very still. His 2 men exchanged something with their eyes. He heard the leather shift. "Those are serious allegations," Vance said. His voice had changed, still controlled, the pleasantness gone out of it and something more careful in its place. "They're not allegations," Eli said. "They're what happened. The difference matters." The cabin door opened behind him. He heard it and felt his jaw tighten because he had told her to stay inside, and she had clearly decided that instruction had a limit she'd just reached. But it wasn't Ruth who came out. It was Clara. She came across the porch and down the step in her too large borrowed shirt and her cloth-wrapped feet, and she walked to the edge of the porch and stood there and looked at Vance with those dark, open, uncomplicated eyes. Precisely the eyes of a child who had not yet learned to pre-sort her fear. She just looked at him the way she looked at everything directly, without armor, with the full, unhurried attention of someone who had nothing to hide and wasn't performing anything. "You're Mr. Vance," she said. Vance looked at her. Something crossed his face quickly. He controlled it, but it was real, and it was there. "Hello, Clara," he said. "You made me stand in the sun," she said. It wasn't an accusation. She said it the way she said true things plainly as a piece of information she was establishing the same way she'd established that the medicine tasted bad and that Drum was a good horse. "I was hungry and I took a biscuit. It was 1 biscuit." She paused. "My hands shook for an hour after." Vance said nothing. "Mr. Eli doesn't make people stand in the sun." Clara continued with the serene, factual certainty of a child describing the world as she found it. "He made me bad medicine that tasted terrible and it worked. He lets me visit the horses in the morning." She looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "I want to stay here." The silence that followed had temperature in it. Then Ruth came to stand in the doorway. She didn't come onto the porch. She stood in the frame with both hands on the edges and looked at Vance with a look Eli had not seen from her before. Not the rock and wall look from the barn. Not the careful measuring look she'd worn for 2 days. Something past both of those, the look of a person who has been afraid for so long that the fear has finally burned itself down to something cleaner and harder than fear. Something that did not flinch and did not look away and had already decided it was done waiting. "If you take us back," Ruth said, "I will tell Judge Caldwell everything, every name, every date." Ruth Harper's hands, the 3 boys from February, the 2 record books, the money from the Morrison farm, and the Henderson place, and every other property that's been paying you for children's labor since you took the post 6 years ago. Her voice was level and unbroken. "I've been keeping track since I was 8 years old. I can't write yet, but I remember everything. Every single thing." May stepped out of his cabin door and stood behind Ruth. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply stood there in the doorway with Dorothy's papers folded inside her coat, and her gray eyes on Vance, and her presence in that doorway said everything her silence held. Vance looked at Ruth. He looked at May. He looked at Eli. Then he looked at Clara, still standing at the edge of the porch with those open, uncomplicated 7-year-old eyes that had told his truth more plainly and more completely than anything else that had been said in the last 10 minutes. Clara looked back at him without moving, without blinking, with the devastating, unperformable steadiness of a child who simply had no idea why she should look away. Vance's face went through something, complicated and internal and visible only at the edges. Then it settled back into control. He folded the paper slowly and put it inside his coat. He buttoned it with precise, unhurried movements. "Mr. Calloway," he said. His voice was different now, quieter. Something in it had recalibrated. "You have put yourself in a very complicated position." "I've been in complicated positions," Eli said. "I'm still standing in them." Vance looked at him for a long moment, then at Ruth, then at Clara. Whatever he found on those faces he turned away from. "The county has a long memory," he said. "So does she," Eli said. Vance mounted his horse with the same careful, practiced correctness he'd done everything, and his 2 men turned with him, and they rode north on the road without looking back. The dust rose behind them slow in the still August air, and hung there long after the sound of the hooves had gone, and then it settled, and the road was empty, and the morning was very quiet. Eli turned around. Clara was still standing on the porch edge, watching the road where Vance had gone, and her hands were pressed together against her chest in that unconscious way she had that made her look like she was praying even when she wasn't. Ruth was still in the doorway. Some of the set had gone out of her jaw. Just some. Enough to see. May had her hand on Ruth's shoulder. Ruth hadn't pulled away from it. Clara turned around and looked at Eli with those dark, serious eyes. "Did I help?" she said. Eli looked at her. At the cloth on her feet, and the sleep still at the corner of one eye, and the borrowed shirt, and the complete undefended sincerity in that question. "Yeah, Clara," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended. "You helped." Tommy Clara looked at Ruth, and then back at Eli, and some internal calculation completed itself, and she squared her small shoulders with the satisfied gravity of a child who had done what she came to do. Then she looked past him at the barn. "Can I go see Bess now?" she said. Ruth made a sound that was not quite a laugh. May's hand tightened briefly on Ruth's shoulder. And Eli stepped aside and said, "Go ahead," and watched her walk toward the barn in her cloth-wrapped feet with the same unhurried confidence she brought to everything, as if the morning's business was settled, and the next thing was already clear. Ruth stepped off the porch and stood in front of him. She tilted her head back to look at his face the way she had from the first direct measuring hunting for the catch hidden in the kindness. He let her look. All of it. Whatever she needed to find. "He'll go to the judge," she said. "He might," Eli said. "Then we need to be ready." "We will be." He looked at her. At the dark circles carved under her eyes, and the clay dust still in her hair from 3 days on the road, and the jaw that had been set so long, it had probably forgotten how to unset. "Ruth, what you said in that doorway, that was the bravest thing I've seen in a long time." Something moved in her face. Not softened. She wasn't built for soft, yet maybe not ever entirely. But something loosened. Some held tension, releasing a grip it had been keeping since before she had words for what she was holding. She swallowed once. "I meant it," she said. "Everything I said. I do remember all of it." "I know you do," Eli said, "and we're going to use every last bit of it." May came down off the porch and stood beside them both. She looked at Eli, then at the road north, where the dust had finally fully settled. "9 days," she said. "9 days," he agreed. From the barn, faint and clear in the still August morning, came the sound of Clara talking to Bess in the low, confiding tone she used with animals and important things. Not the words, just the sound of it, steady and unhurried and entirely unafraid. The 9 days moved, the way time moved, when something was coming at the end of it. Not fast, not slow, but with a particular quality of weight that pressed down on every hour and made each one feel accounted for. Dorothy came out to the ranch the second day with her files and her pen and 3 hours of patience, and she sat with Ruth at the table, and did what May had started: organize the testimony into the order that would land hardest, the way you organized ammunition before you needed it. Ruth corrected her on 2 dates and 1 name without apology, and Dorothy received each correction with a brisk nod and changed it in her notes without comment, and after that, they worked with the easy efficiency of 2 people who had established what the other one was worth and could move forward on that basis. Clara sat in the corner during these sessions and braided rope and did not interrupt, which everyone in the room understood was its own form of discipline, because Clara had opinions about most things and was capable of sharing them at length. She held them through all 3 sessions Dorothy came for, and on the 3rd day, when Dorothy was gathering her papers to leave, Clara said, "Mrs. Dorothy, if the judge asks me something, can I answer it?" Dorothy looked at her. "Why would the judge ask you something?" "Because I was there for most of it," Clara said simply. "And I'm little, so people think I didn't understand. But I understood." Dorothy looked at Eli. Eli looked at May. May looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at Clara with the expression she wore when Clara had done something that was simultaneously inconvenient and exactly right. "If the judge asks you something," Dorothy said carefully, "you answer it exactly the way you just answered me, plain and true." Clara nodded satisfied and went back to her rope. May stayed at the ranch. There was no formal conversation about it. She'd ridden back the first day to collect what she needed from her room at the boarding house, and returned before sundown. And after that, she was simply there. The way practical things were there, when they were needed, without making a production of the decision. She slept in the loft, and took the early morning watch and made coffee before anyone else was up, and rode to town twice on business that had to do with her own filing, and came back each time with the tight, controlled expression of a woman doing damage assessment in real time. On the fourth evening, Eli found her standing at the north window after the girls had gone to sleep. She had a cup she wasn't drinking in both hands, and she was looking out at the dark, with the particular stillness of someone doing hard arithmetic on something that didn't have clean numbers. "Thomas filed the adverse claim," she said without turning. "Dorothy's friend at the county office sent word this afternoon. Dorothy knows." She set the cup down on the sill. "He's got a hearing date the week after Caldwell comes through. If I lose on the custodial, if this goes wrong for you and the girls, I lose the precedent I need for my own filing." She paused. "I need you to know that. I need you to know I'm not here only for them." "I know that," Eli said. She turned then, looked at him the way she looked at things she was taking seriously. "You're not bothered by it. You told me straight," he said. "Nothing to be bothered about. Straight talk is what I prefer." She held his gaze for a moment. "James used to say I was too direct," she said. "He said it like it was something I should work on." "Sounds like something a man said when he wanted the world arranged for his comfort," Eli said. Something shifted in her face. Not the almost smile this time. Something quieter, more considered. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it was." She picked up the cup again. "He wasn't a bad man. He just never thought very hard about the things that weren't in front of him." She paused. "I spent 6 years thinking that was enough." Eli leaned against the wall beside the window, not crowding her space, just occupying the same quiet. "And now I think enough is a very low standard," she said, "and I spent too long calling it something better." She looked at the dark outside. "Your wife. How long were you married?" 6 years, he said. "Happy?" He thought about the question honestly the way it deserved. "Yes," he said. "We were good together. She had a way of making a place feel like it was meant to be exactly what it was. Like the room fit better when she was in it." He paused. "I forgot how to be in rooms after." May was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it the way she meant most things, directly, without embellishment, with the full weight of it behind the words. "So am I," he said. And they stood together at the window in the dark August night, two people who had each lost the shape of their life and were quietly, without announcing it, trying to figure out what shapes were possible now. Ruth came into the county courthouse on the last Thursday of August, with her feet in the first proper shoes she'd worn in 8 days. Dorothy had produced them from somewhere without explanation, and set them by Ruth's chair that morning, and her hair combed back, and her jaw set in the way that meant she was ready. Clara walked beside her with her hand inside Ruth's, and her dark eyes moving through the room with that open, methodical curiosity she brought to everything new. May walked on Ruth's other side, and Dorothy came behind, and Eli came last, and they went into the building together and took the left side of the room, all 5 of them, on the same bench. There were 14 people in the seats. Eli had not told anyone to come. He had not asked. He looked at the faces and recognized most of them. Pete Aldridge from the feed store, Carolyn Webb, who ran the seamstress shop, the Henderson brothers from the livery, 4 women whose names he knew, and several faces he knew without names. He looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at the seats with the composed expression of a woman who had done what needed doing and didn't require commentary on the doing of it. Vance arrived with an attorney from Cheyenne, a smooth-voiced man with a leather case he set on the table with practiced authority. Vance looked across the room at Eli with an expression that had all the warmth pressed out of it, and nothing left but calculation. His 2 men sat behind him in the first row and did not look at anyone. Clara looked at Vance across the room with the same open, undefended steadiness she'd had on the porch. Vance looked back at her once and then looked away from whatever he found. Judge Harriet Caldwell came in at exactly the hour she'd set and sat down with the economy of motion of a woman who did not waste time on entrances. She was older than Eli had expected, with gray hair pinned back severely and eyes the color of good steel that moved across the room with the precise cataloging attention of someone who had been reading rooms for 30 years and could take in a great deal in a very short time. She opened her ledger and did not look up while she spoke. 2 competing filings, she said. Recovery petition submitted by Superintendent Harold Vance of the County Welfare Administration regarding minor children Ruth and Clara, current wards of the county home. Counter petition for emergency custodial placement submitted by Eli Calloway of this county, with supporting letter from Dorothy Crane of Harlan. She looked up. "Mr. Vance, your counsel will speak first." The attorney stood. He was good at what he did. His language was careful and layered and built around words like welfare and structured environment and legal obligation, and he arranged them the way you arranged furniture to make a room look larger than it was. He spoke for 12 minutes, and when he finished, he sat down with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd constructed something solid. Eli stood up. He was not a man who made speeches. He stood and looked at Judge Caldwell and told the truth in plain language: the barn, the pitchfork, Clara's fever, the cloth on Ruth's feet. He told her about the biscuit and the noon sun. He told her about Ruth Harper's hands and what the supervisor's record said and what had actually occurred. He told her about the 3 boys and the February placement that no one could locate. He told her about 2 record books. He spoke for 8 minutes and did not editorialize and did not perform, and when he was done, he sat down. Judge Caldwell had been writing. She finished a line. "Miss Ruth," she said. Ruth stood up. She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands. A small, automatic gesture, the only visible sign of nerves. And then she folded her hands in front of her, and she looked at the judge, and she began. She did not look at Vance. She did not need to. She kept her eyes on Judge Caldwell, and she spoke with the flat, precise delivery of someone who had been organizing this information in her head for 2 years, and had been waiting for a room that was worth spending it in. Names, dates, the specific thing, what preceded it, what followed. Ruth Harper. June 14th. The Morrison farm burns on both hands. Kitchen accident, in the record open flame, in a closed building in the record. The 3 boys. Benjamin Marsh, age 9. Samuel Croft, age 7. Peter Croft, age 5, removed. February 3rd family placement, recorded as a Cheyenne address that Dorothy had already confirmed did not exist. The record book, with the real figures. The record book for the inspector. The difference between them line by line from memory without hesitation. She spoke for 13 minutes. Her voice stayed level through all of it, except one moment, one single moment when she said, "He told me to my face if we ran again, he'd separate us." And it caught just barely. Just the space of one breath, and then she had it back and continued. The room was entirely silent. When she finished, she sat down. Clara took her hand under the bench immediately, the same reflex Ruth had always had, with her automatic practiced running in both directions now. Judge Caldwell set her pen down and looked at her hands on the desk. She looked at them for a full 10 seconds. Then she looked up at Vance. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I have some questions." What followed was not gentle. Caldwell asked in the same flat, unhurried voice she used for everything, but there was something beneath the flatness now. The quality of a woman who had heard a great many things in a great many courtrooms and had arrived at a place past which she was not going to be moved by careful language or institutional confidence. She asked about the punishment records. She asked about the labor arrangements with the Morrison farm and the Henderson place and 3 other properties whose names came from Dorothy's files and that Vance's attorney wrote down with the quick motion of a man doing emergency accounting. Vance answered carefully. He used the words he'd been using his whole career, and they had always been sufficient armor before, and Caldwell let him finish each answer completely before asking the next question, and she wrote everything down, and the room watched the space between his answers and her next question get smaller each time. His attorney spoke twice. Both times, Caldwell looked at him briefly and said, "Noted," and continued. When she'd finished her questions, she set her pen down again. She looked at the room once at Vance, at Eli, at Dorothy, at May, at Ruth, with Clara's hand in hers. Her steel-colored eyes stopped on Clara for a moment, who was sitting straight-backed beside her sister and looking at the judge with the open, respectful attention she'd give to anyone who was speaking about something important. Something in Caldwell's expression shifted. Fractional. Real. Then she looked down at her ledger and spoke. The court finds sufficient documented cause to suspend the county recovery order effective immediately pending full investigation of conditions and practices at the county home under Superintendent Vance's administration. She did not pause. Temporary custodial placement of the minor children Ruth and Clara is granted to Eli Calloway of this county contingent on welfare review in 60 days. She looked up at Vance. Mr. Vance, this court is ordering a full audit of your facility's records, all records, both sets, as well as a full accounting of all labor arrangements with private landowners going back 6 years. You are advised to make those records available voluntarily, as the alternative will be considerably less comfortable. Vance's attorney leaned in. Vance listened. His face, for the first time since he'd walked into that room, showed something beneath the control. Just long enough to be real. Your Honor, the attorney began. I've made my ruling, Caldwell said. She closed the ledger. Court is adjourned. The sound that moved through the room was not loud. It was more like a collective exhale. 14 people releasing something they'd been holding through the whole proceeding. The particular breath of people who cared about an outcome and had no power over it, and had just learned which way it went. Ruth did not move for 4 full seconds. Eli watched her face and saw exactly what was happening. The checking, the rechecking, the hunting for the catch, the wall behind the door. He watched her run through it fast and thorough, and then run out of walls to check and find nothing but the fact of what had been said. No catch, no hidden clause, no fine print where the trap was. Clara looked up at her. Ruth, she whispered. Did we win? Ruth's throat moved. Her eyes went bright and she pressed her mouth shut for one hard moment. Then she said quietly, Yeah, Clara, we won. Clara received this with a nod of deep satisfaction. She appeared to consider the matter fully settled because she turned immediately to Eli with the solemn gravity of someone delivering a considered report. I didn't say anything the judge didn't ask me, she said. I noticed, Eli said. I was proud of you. Clara straightened her shoulders. Dorothy told me to. Good advice from Dorothy, May said from his other side, and there was something in her voice that was not quite steady, not quite unsteady, that lived in the honest space between them. Vance left without speaking. His attorney followed with the leather case, and the 2 men behind him filed out last, and the door of the courthouse closed behind all of them with a final ordinary sound that meant more than any dramatic exit could have managed. The 14 people in the seats did not leave immediately. Some of them came to Dorothy. Pete Aldridge shook Eli's hand without a word, and Eli shook it back, and that was sufficient. Caroline Webb crouched in front of Clara and asked her name, and Clara told her. And Caroline said it was a fine, strong name, and Clara agreed that it was, and then asked whether Caroline knew anything about horses, which led to a conversation that lasted several minutes. May stood beside Eli through all of it. Not behind him, beside him. Close enough that he was aware of the specific warmth of her presence, the way you became aware of things that had been absent long enough that their return registered in your whole body before your mind caught up with it. He did not comment on it. She did not move away. Ruth stood at his other side and watched the room with those green eyes, and he could see something happening in them, something slow and careful and not yet complete. The constant calculating watchfulness was still there. It would probably always be partly there. Some things left marks that did not fully fade, and pretending otherwise did nobody any good. But alongside it, growing carefully in the space the morning had opened up, was something else. Something green and tentative, the way things grew when they'd been in the dark a long time, and were not entirely sure yet what they'd grown into. On the ride back, Clara fell asleep against May's arm before they'd made it a mile. May shifted to accommodate her weight without breaking the conversation she was having with Dorothy about the timing of her own filing. One hand coming up automatically to steady Clara's shoulder, and the gesture was so practiced and so natural that Eli wasn't entirely sure May knew she'd done it. Ruth rode beside Eli at the front of the wagon. She looked at the road for a long time without speaking. The August heat had eased slightly, the way it eased sometimes in the late afternoon, when the sun began its angle downward, and something in the air remembered that it was supposed to cool eventually. "He'll come back with something else," she said. "Vance, he's not done." "No," Eli said. "He's not done. But neither are we. And now we're in the record, and he's under audit, and every move he makes from here goes through a judge who's already heard your testimony." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Dorothy says 60 days for the review." 60 days, he agreed. "And then it's permanent. If everything's in order, Dorothy knows what the review looks for. May knows. Between the two of them, we'll be ready." Ruth looked at him sideways. "May's staying." He looked at the road ahead, at the line where the afternoon light hit the pale, dry grass and turned it briefly, unexpectedly gold. "I think that's her decision to make," he said. Ruth appeared to consider this with great seriousness. "She's good," she said. Not a compliment exactly, more like an assessment delivered after sufficient observation. "She doesn't talk around things." "No," Eli agreed. "She doesn't. Clara likes her. Clara likes Drum too, and she's known that horse 4 days." "Clara's a good judge," Ruth said. "She just looks different doing it than I do." She paused. "You should tell May she should stay, if that's what you want." He glanced at her. She was looking at the road with the same direct, practical expression she wore when she was telling him something true and expected him to receive it as such. "You giving me advice," he said. "You gave me enough of it," she said. "Seems fair." The ranch came into view ahead, the cabin and the barn and the yard between them shimmering slightly in the late heat, and the smoke from the stove that Dorothy had banked before they left, rising thin and steady into the pale August sky. Clara woke as the wagon slowed, the way she woke, sudden, complete, immediately grounded by the presence of whoever was beside her. She blinked at May, she blinked at the cabin, she looked at Eli. "Are we home?" she said. The word went through the air between them, and sat there. Eli wrapped the reins and set the brake and looked at the cabin. The repaired board on the north side. The window he'd reframed 2 summers ago. The door whose frame he'd touched every time he went through it for 5 years, going out and coming back, going out and coming back alone each time on both ends of the motion. He thought about 2 candles. One for what summer had taken, one for what it hadn't. "Yeah," he said. "We're home." Clara climbed down from the wagon with the complete physical confidence of a child who had decided where she belonged and intended to confirm it immediately. She ran to the barn because that was where Bess was, and her feet in the borrowed shoes made a small, quick sound on the packed ground. And then she was gone around the barn door, and the yard was briefly warmly loud with the sound of her greeting the horse. Ruth climbed down more slowly. She stood for a moment, looking at the cabin with an expression that was doing something private. Then she looked at Eli. Then she looked at May, who was still on the wagon seat, watching Ruth with the gray eyes that did not perform anything they didn't mean. 60 days, Ruth said to both of them. 60 days, May said. Ruth squared her shoulders. She walked to the cabin door and put her hand on the frame for just a moment, the way you touched something you were making sure was real. Then she pushed the door open and went inside. May climbed down from the wagon and stood beside Eli in the yard. The afternoon was going gold around them, and the heat had finally genuinely begun to ease, and from the barn came the sound of Clara's voice in the low, confiding tone she used with horses and important things. May looked at the cabin door where Ruth had gone. Then she looked at Eli. "She told me on the ride that you should ask me to stay," she said. "I know," he said. "I was there." And he looked at her. At the gray eyes and the riding coat worn in August, and the folded papers still inside it, and the particular squared-off way she held herself in the world, like she'd decided on the amount of space she was taking up and intended to keep it. He looked at all of it plainly, and without pretending he wasn't looking. "May," he said, "stay." She looked at him for a long moment, not performing consideration, actually considering the way she did everything completely and without shortcuts. 60 days is a long time, she said. "It is," he agreed. "A lot can happen in 60 days. "Generally does," he said. Something moved in her face. The almost smile arrived finally fully, without the shadow in front of it. It changed everything about her expression, and did not make it softer so much as it made it true in a different way, the way a room looked different when you opened a window in it. "All right, Calloway," she said. "I'll stay." Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady. Outside, the summer evening settled over the ranch with the first real gentleness it had offered in months, and the light went long and gold across the yard, and the barn, and the road that led to town, and the road that led away from it. And somewhere in the barn, Clara was telling Bess everything that had happened in the courthouse in complete and specific detail, and Bess was listening with the patient, warm attention that made her Clara's favorite, and the sound of it carried through the still August air like something that had come home. The 60 days did not pass gently. Vance's attorney filed 3 separate motions in the first 2 weeks: procedural challenges to the emergency placement, a request to delay the audit, and a formal complaint against Dorothy Crane, alleging improper influence over the court filing process. Dorothy received news of the 3rd motion over coffee on a Tuesday morning, read the document twice, set it down, and said, "Well, he's scared," with the composed satisfaction of a woman who considered fear in the right person to be a form of progress. Judge Caldwell denied all 3 motions in the same week. The audit went forward. What it found took another 2 weeks to compile and a full day to present to the court in Cheyenne because there was a great deal of it. The 2 record books. 11 years of labor arrangements with 16 properties across the county. Children as young as 6 working full days in fields and kitchens and on fence lines with the wages when wages existed at all going into an account in Vance's name at a bank in Laramie. The 3 boys from February were found in April working a cattle operation 40 miles north, under names that weren't theirs, placed there by a man who had paperwork that said he had the authority, and a judge in Cheyenne who had looked at that paperwork very carefully and was now looking at Harold Vance in a very different room than the one where everything had seemed so settled. Ruth heard about the boys on a Wednesday afternoon when Dorothy came out to the ranch with the news. She was at the table working through the reading lessons May had set for her. She had decided with the same flat, practical intensity she brought to most decisions that not being able to write was a liability she intended to correct, and she had been correcting it with a focus that made May say privately to Eli that she'd never seen anyone learn to read as if their life depended on it. And Eli had said, because he'd been paying attention, that for Ruth, it always had. Ruth listened to Dorothy without interrupting. When Dorothy finished, Ruth looked at the table for a long moment. "Benjamin, Samuel, and Peter," she said. "Those are their names, not whatever he called them." "Those are their names," Dorothy agreed. "And they're going to be given back." Ruth's jaw moved. She pressed her mouth shut and looked at the paper in front of her, at the letters she'd been practicing, and she did not say anything else for a moment. Clara looked at her from across the table, and did not say anything either, which was how Clara expressed the things that were too serious for words. Then Ruth picked up her pen and kept writing. The welfare review was scheduled for the 58th day, 2 days before the deadline. The county welfare officer who came was not from Vance's office. Vance's office had been under external administration since the 3rd week of the audit, but a woman named Mrs. Horton from the territorial office in Cheyenne sent specifically because Judge Caldwell had requested someone with no prior connection to the county home. She arrived in the morning and spent 4 hours at the ranch, and she was thorough in the way of someone who had learned that the world was full of people who could make 4 hours of inspection look like anything they wanted it to look like, and had decided to be difficult to fool. She looked at the sleeping arrangements. She looked at the food stores. She asked Clara directly while Eli was outside whether anyone had ever made her do anything she didn't want to do, and Clara said, "Mr. Eli made me drink bad medicine when I was sick." And when Mrs. Horton said, "Did you want to?" Clara thought about it seriously and said, "No, but I'm glad I did. So I think that's different." Mrs. Horton wrote something in her ledger and moved on. She spoke with Ruth for 40 minutes alone in the cabin, while Eli and May waited outside in the August heat that was finally, in the last week of the month, beginning to consider the possibility of becoming September. May stood with her arms folded and her eyes on the closed cabin door, with the expression she wore when she was doing the math on something she couldn't fully control and didn't entirely like. "She'll be fine," Eli said. "I know she'll be fine," May said. Ruth could talk her way out of a locked room. "I'm thinking about what fine means on paper and what it means when someone else is holding the pen." "Mrs. Horton's pen is cleaner than the last one." "Most things are cleaner than Vance," May said. "That's a low standard." He looked at her sideways. She had her jaw set in the way she said it when she was worried, and had decided to be practical about it instead. He had learned in 60 days the specific geography of May Whitfield's expressions, which ones meant she was thinking, which meant she'd already decided, which meant she was about to say something true that nobody else in the room was going to enjoy hearing. The jaw-set one meant she was carrying something she hadn't put down yet and wasn't sure she should. "It'll hold," he said. She looked at him. "You keep saying that." "I keep meaning it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then the jaw set eased just slightly. "I know you do," she said. "That's the part I'm learning to rely on." The cabin door opened, and Ruth came out. She walked across the porch and down the step and stood in front of them, and her face gave nothing away in the immediate way of someone who had delivered testimony in a courthouse and in a welfare interview in the same 2 months, and had learned how to hold her expression during the part where you didn't know yet. "She asked me what I wanted," Ruth said. "What did you say?" May asked. "I said I wanted to stay here." She paused. She asked why. And Ruth looked at Eli. "I said because it's the first place anybody ever stood in a door for me instead of in front of one." A muscle moved in her jaw. She wrote that down. Mrs. Horton came out of the cabin 20 minutes later, spoke briefly with Eli on the porch about the practical arrangements, the schooling schedule Dorothy had established, the room he'd added on the north side of the cabin over the past 3 weeks, with Pete Aldridge's help, the medical account he'd opened with the doctor in Harlan, and then she closed her ledger and said she would have her report to Judge Caldwell within 5 days. She shook Eli's hand. She nodded to May. She looked at Clara, who had come out of the barn specifically to be present for the conclusion and was standing in the yard with hay in her hair and Bess's lead rope still in her hand. "Goodbye, Clara," Mrs. Horton said. "Goodbye, Mrs. Horton," Clara said gravely. "I hope your horse is as good as Bess." Mrs. Horton appeared to consider this. "I'll aspire to it," she said, and walked to her buggy. Clara watched her go with the satisfied expression of someone whose affairs had been concluded well. Then she looked at Ruth. "Did we do it?" Ruth looked at Eli. Eli looked at May. May looked at the road where Mrs. Horton's buggy was raising its thin line of dust. "We'll know in 5 days," Ruth said. "But do you think—" Ruth looked at her sister. Something in her face did what it had been slowly, carefully, incrementally doing over the course of 60 days, opening one careful degree at a time, like a door on a hinge that had been rusted shut and was being worked loose with patience rather than force. "Yeah," she said, "I think." The letter from Judge Caldwell's office came on the 4th day. Dorothy brought it herself, rather than sending it, which told Eli everything before she opened her mouth. She came up the road in her wagon in the late morning and tied up outside, and walked to the porch with the letter in her hand and the composed expression of a woman carrying good news, which on Dorothy looked like only the very slightest relaxation around the eyes. They all read it together at the table. Dorothy read it aloud because Ruth was still working her way through unfamiliar words, and this was not the moment to practice. She read it in her brisk, precise way, without performance. And when she reached the operative language permanent custodial placement granted to Eli Calloway, conditions met, case closed, pending annual review, she set the paper down and looked at them. Clara said, "What does permanent mean?" "It means it doesn't have an end," May said. Clara looked at Eli. "Like forever." "Like forever," he said. Clara absorbed this with a slow nod of great seriousness. Then she pushed back from the table and went around it and put both arms around Eli's middle with the complete, unself-conscious certainty of a child who had decided this was where she belonged and had simply been waiting for the paperwork to agree with her. He put his hand on the back of her head and held on. Ruth sat at the table and looked at the letter. She read it again herself, slowly following the words with one finger, the way May had taught her. Then she read it a third time. He understood what she was doing, the same thing she'd done after Caldwell's ruling in the courthouse. Running through it, looking for the catch, hunting for the wall behind the door. This time, she found no wall. She set the letter down. She looked at it sitting on the table in Dorothy's precise handwriting and the court's official stamp, and she looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked up at Eli. And what was on her face was not the rock and wall look from the barn, not the measuring look from the first day, not the ancient exhaustion of a child who had been running the math alone for too long. What was on her face was something he had not seen there before, something that had no armor in it at all. Not soft exactly. Ruth was not built for soft, and likely never would be entirely, and there was nothing wrong with that. But open. Genuinely, unguardedly open, the way a window is open, still solid at its edges, still a real thing with real material, but letting something through. "Thank you," she said. 2 words. She said them the way she'd said them the first morning after Clara's fever broke stiff, like she wasn't entirely sure of the cost of them. But she said them, and he understood what they carried all the mornings she'd checked the door, all the nights she hadn't slept, all the miles of road in cloth-wrapped feet, all the calculations run alone in the dark with no one to check the numbers. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." Dorothy picked up her hat. She looked around the room once with the expression she wore when she was accounting for something. The fire, the letter on the table, the sleeping room with the new door on the north side. Clara still holding on to Eli's middle with her head pressed against his chest. May beside him with one hand on his arm, in the easy, unlabored way of someone who had stopped calculating whether she was allowed to stand there. Dorothy looked at all of it, and something moved briefly across her face that she did not put into words, because the room did not need words. It needed witness, and she was providing it. "I'll see you Sunday," she said and went out. May's hearing on the Whitfield land dispute came 2 weeks later, after the first real cool morning of September had arrived and reminded the territory that it had a full season of intentions other than heat. Thomas Whitfield's 3 lawyers were good, and his adverse claim was constructed carefully, but the deed was May's, and the deed was clear, and Judge Caldwell, who by coincidence was still riding the Harlan circuit in the aftermath of the Vance audit, had the particular quality of attention that did not benefit men who relied on other people not reading the fine print. The ruling took 11 minutes to deliver, and 4 sentences to say what it needed to say. The land was May's. The adverse claim was denied. Thomas Whitfield's attorneys packed their leather cases with the brisk efficiency of men who had already moved on to billing, and Thomas Whitfield himself left the courthouse without looking at May, which she received as its own form of answer. She stood outside the courthouse in the September morning and held the ruling in both hands and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Eli stood beside her and waited. Clara stood on his other side, eating an apple Dorothy had given her and watching May with her frank, patient attention. Ruth leaned against the courthouse wall, with her arms folded, and said nothing, which was her version of presence. "It's mine," May said finally. Not to any of them in particular. Just saying it out loud the way you said something true that you'd been fighting for long enough that saying it felt strange and necessary at the same time. "Yes," Eli said. She looked at him. James's family never believed I had a right to it. James's family was wrong, he said. Yes. She folded the ruling and put it in her coat. They were. She was quiet for a moment. The September air moved through the street, the first real air in months that had the particular quality of change in it, the smell of something turning. I'm going to build the east fence line back properly before winter. It's been down for 2 years. I'll help, Eli said. She looked at him sideways. It's my land, Calloway. I know that, he said. I'll help anyway. Something moved in her face. Is that how this works? She said. You just decide to help. I decide to help, he said. You decide whether you want it, same as it's been. She held his gaze for a long moment. The gray eyes were doing the thing they did in the afternoon light, going lighter, taking in more of what was around them. Then she said, I want it. In the plain, direct way she said everything that was true, without embellishment, with the full weight of it in the words. Clara looked up from her apple. Good, she said with the comprehensive satisfaction of someone whose view on the matter had been fixed for some time. Ruth pushed off the wall. Can we go home now? She said. I want to finish the chapter Dorothy said. And that was how they went back, all 5 of them in the wagon, with the September air moving through the open country, and the summer finally genuinely releasing its grip on the land around them. The grass beginning its slow turn toward gold, the sky doing the particular blue that only came when the heat broke, and the world remembered its other registers. Clara sat between May and Ruth on the wagon bench and fell asleep with her head against May's arm before they'd made 3 miles, and May shifted to hold her without breaking conversation. And Ruth watched the road ahead with those green eyes that had stopped looking for the wall behind every door and had started slowly learning to look at what was actually there. That night, after the girls were asleep, Eli sat at the table with the lamp the way he had every night for 5 years. The lamp that had always been one flame burning for the one it had lost burning because the alternative was too dark to sit in. May came and sat across from him. She didn't have a cup. She just sat elbows on the table and looked at him with the gray eyes that didn't perform anything they didn't mean. You're thinking, she said. Usually am, he said. About what? He looked at the lamp, at the single flame burning in the September dark. About this time last year, he said. What this table looked like. What this room felt like. He paused. What I'd told myself it was going to keep looking like. May was quiet, listening the way she listened completely, without filling the space before he was done with it. I was wrong about a lot of things, he said. I thought I was protecting myself. Turns out I was just sitting in the dark and calling it wisdom. He looked at her. You came through that door and didn't pretend the room was something it wasn't. And the girls came through that barn wall and didn't pretend the world was something it wasn't. And somewhere in between all of it, I stopped being able to pretend either. May looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his plain, and without ceremony, the way she did most things that mattered to her. Good, she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that in the lamplight while the September night settled around the cabin with its first real coolness, and the fire burned at their backs. And from the sleeping room came the steady, quiet breathing of 2 girls who had run out of road and found something better at the end of it. After a while, Eli reached to the shelf above the table and brought down a second candle. He lit it from the first. He set it beside the lamp and looked at both of them burning together in the dark. 2 small flames, steady and unhurried, putting light into a room that had held only one for 5 long years. May looked at the 2 flames. She looked at him. She understood what he meant by it the same way she understood most things he meant directly, without requiring it to be explained. 5 years is a long time to sit in the dark, she said. It is, he said. You're done with that now. He looked at the candles. At the light they made together fuller and steadier than either would have made alone. He thought about 2 girls asleep in the next room, one who remembered everything, and one who said true things, and both of whom had walked 3 days through August heat, and ended up in his barn, and changed everything that he'd been so certain was finished. He thought about May across the table with her hand in his, This woman who took up her proper amount of space in the world and did not apologize for it, who said what she meant and meant what she said, and had decided with the same clear-eyed practicality she brought to everything that this table and this room and this man were worth staying for. Outside, the September wind moved through the grass with a sound like something turning over into something new. "Yeah," Eli said. "I'm done with that now." And he was. Not because the past had stopped being the past, it hadn't, and it wouldn't, and some things left marks that the years only softened, rather than erased. But because the past was the past, and this was something else. This was a table with 2 candles burning. This was a room with 4 people in it. This was a door that opened from the inside and stayed open, and nobody on the right side of it was going anywhere. Winter had not gotten to decide what survived. It had gotten to make things hard and make things costly and strip everything down to what was essential, and the essential things had proven themselves. They were still here. All of them still here. And that was not a small thing. That was in the end the only thing that had ever mattered.